Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ACEC Research Institute's Future of Engineering Roundtable Series. In today's session, the State of the Engineering Economy, Q3 2024. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping announcements. For the easiest view, move your mouse to the top of your screen and select Gallery View. This will allow you to see all panelists. Your microphone was muted upon entry, but if you wish to ask a question or offer a comment, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as time permits. This event is open to the media, and the press is invited to participate as well with our other attendees by asking a question through the Q&A box. We are recording today's event for future viewing that will be posted later this afternoon on the Institute's YouTube channel. If you require any technical assistance, please feel free to send a message to ACEC Research Institute privately through the chat box, and I will be happy to assist you. Now, allow me to introduce the Executive Director of the ACEC Research Institute, Daphne Bryant, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to have you here as we unveil the results of the Q3 business sentiment. And I'm happy that we have Joe Bates back with us, the author of this study, as well as Thomas Grogan from ACEC, who's going to provide some insights from an ACEC perspective and some of the broader economic metrics that we're going to share with you today. I want to give a big shout out to all of our donors that are on the call as well. Thank you for your continued support of the Institute. We would not be able to do this and release this type of information without you. So a shout out to you. Thank you very much for your continued support. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe and Thomas to get us started so that we can dig in. I know they've got a lot of great content to share with us today.
Thanks, Daphne. Great to be here again today with you all. For those of you who heard me before, might sound a little congestion. I came down with COVID last Friday, so just bear with me if I have any slip-ups. I do apologize in advance. But Thomas is here. He can pick up where I fall down, and we'll be ready to answer any questions you all have. So please remember to ask us questions in the Q&A. We're happy to take those throughout or at the end. We're going to go through 3 different areas today. As we usually do, look at how the economy is doing today, and then look at how our industry is performing right now, and then we'll look at the future. So we'll just jump right into it. How are we doing in terms of the U.S. economy? Well, we have some really good news in today's webinar and a lot of really positive data. So in Q1, you may recall, we had a pretty soft report in GDP. It was 1.4%. It was definitely below where most folks thought it was going to be, but there was definite consensus that Q2 would come back a little stronger. And in fact, we did see that much stronger and very solid GDP growth in the fourth quarter. We're going to get the updated reading on that. It'll be the second estimate for Q2. We'll get that on this week on the 29th. Sorry, we don't have that for you today, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us when we can see it, and so we'll have to wait. But watch out for that. If it's an upward revision, that's even better news. If it's a downward revision, I wouldn't be too concerned with that unless it's pretty dramatic. But the data that's coming in over the next few weeks is going to be instrumental in what the Federal Reserve does in September, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through today's presentation. So GDP is solid, and that's good news. No concerns there. We also see that the labor market is actually softening a bit, and that's good news. I've been talking about this for quite some time, and we've needed to see jobs slow down just a little bit and that unemployment rate tick up. We are finally seeing that the effects of the interest rate hikes that the Federal Reserve started some time ago are finally making their way into the labor market. So this, some people may be concerned about this. And of course, we had a reading in July that a lot of people were very concerned about. That caused turmoil in the markets for a few days. 108,000 new jobs, 180,000 were expected. But again, it's one data point. Other data points have come out since then, which have reassured the markets and investors that, we're not going to see a recession. But overall, it is good news to see a slowdown in the labor market. We do need to see that so that we can sort of get back to a more stable and even labor market. When we look at our own industry, that falls into the professional and related occupations. We see it at 3.3% unemployment. It's typically below the overall unemployment rate, and we see that again. But this is the first time in a while that it's over 3%, and that is also good news. Typically, this number has been in the 2% range, even below 2%. So we're starting to see that number come up a little bit as well. So that again is also good news. Just we need to see an evening out of the labor markets. I've talked about labor force participation rate for a long time. We still are not seeing a recovery back to pre-pandemic levels. This is the percentage of individuals who are able to work and are working. So we are still 0.6 below where we were before the pandemic. And that is a bit of a concern because that's a million or so individuals that still are not in the labor market that once were. And in fact, when we look at this and we drill down and to see who are these individuals, it's honestly, it's really surprising. It's mostly white workers over 20 years of age. So we've seen return to normal, so to speak, of those individuals who are Black or Latino, Asian as well. Young workers are finding jobs. So it's a really interesting dynamic that we're seeing right now.
Hey, Joe, on that point, I know several quarters ago we talked about this, and one of the points you made was sort of the long COVID impact. Is that still part of this, or is this something different?
I do think that long COVID continues to be a problem. The data that we have on long COVID shows that between 10 and 30% of individuals who have symptomatic COVID end up having one or more symptoms of long COVID. And it can, in certain cases, be very debilitating. So the last time I saw numbers on it, there was an estimate that perhaps 3-4 million individuals might be on the sidelines because of long COVID. So there's certainly a lot of individuals who may be struggling with the long-term effects of COVID, and I do think that that has something to do with these numbers. I haven't seen updated data on that recently, but yeah, I do think that that's still at play here as well.
Thanks. Just curious on that.
Sure. So we also see monthly consumer spending, which of course is 2/3 of the economy. That's holding up very well. You can see here we have a lot of solid readings. These are month over month numbers. So you multiply them by 12 or average them out, multiply it, et cetera, whatever, and you end up with your annual rate. Your annual rate still very, very healthy here in terms of consumer spending. So that's one of those numbers that came out that is very solid. We'll get another update on that at the end of the week for July's number. So keep a lookout for that as well. If we see some weakening there, that just gives more fuel for the Federal Reserve to start lowering interest rates in September.
There was also a follow-on comment, Joe, maybe to the comment I made about the long COVID, about if mental health is a contributing factor to that previous slide that you shared on participation rate.
Sure. I haven't seen any data on that, but I do think that overall we've seen a decline in the last several years in the average life expectancy. That's one overall metric that you can look at determining sort of the overall health of individuals in the United States. And we've seen a decline in average life expectancy due to COVID. And so I think there's probably a lot of health related reasons that could be impacting the participation rate in the labor force. I think there's definitely not just one reason. When we look at the headline inflation number, it actually fell below 3% for the first time since March of 2021. So the first time in 3 years that it's gotten that low. That's really, really good news. And so what we're seeing is through June of last year, that inflation number came down very, very quickly, which is quite odd. But since then, it's been slowly going down. And that's more typical of inflation when it's gotten high and you're trying to get it back down. So it's not unusual, but the Federal Reserve has certainly been waiting to see it get below that 3% mark. They want to feel confident that it's going to hit their 2% benchmark target before they start lowering rates. Now, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, he did say on Friday, he said the time has come. He came right out and said we are going to start lowering interest rates, but he said how much, the timing of it, the duration of the decline of the cuts is yet to be determined by the data that we receive. So that's why we're all really waiting for the numbers to come in over the next few weeks and see what happens. Overall, the markets is sort of priced in a 100 basis point drop, which is 1 percentage point drop. So from 5.5% target rate to 4.5 in the next by this end of this year. And there's only 3 meetings left for the Federal Reserve. So personally, and Thomas, I'd love you to jump in, give us your thoughts on this, but I'm not sure we're going to see a full 100 basis point drop in the next few months. I think the Federal Reserve is going to be more guarded and a little bit more cautious. That's what they tend to do. So I'm personally feeling like, yeah, we'll probably see a 0.25% rate cut in September, but I think we just have to wait and see. What's your reading of the tea leaves, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I don't think the data and the Fed has made it a point to say they are very data dependent. The data is fully supporting needing all those rate cuts. So it will probably be a cut in September and then see how, all this labor market employment PCE data performs over the next 2 or 3 months, but expecting a full 100 basis points cut by the end of the year does not seem likely.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that as well. When we look at the core inflation rate, it's been higher than the headline number. And this is the more stable number because you strip out the volatile food and energy, particularly oil prices. And you see that's still at 3.2%. Now it has been coming down significantly over the last few months. So that is really good news as well. So all the metrics are moving in the right direction, and we're just going to have to wait and see exactly how things happen here in the next few months. But the first data I have for you from the sentiment survey from the third quarter here, this is our net rating system. The net rating system, for those of you who have not heard us talk about this before, is we take the percentage of positive responses and subtract the percentage of negative responses, and that's our net rating. So you could have a plus 100 if everyone answers positively, or a negative 100 if everyone were to answer negatively regarding their sentiment on a particular issue. Now, in this case with inflation, the way we worded this is that I'm extremely concerned about the impact inflation will have on my firm in the coming year. So a positive number here is actually not good. But what we're seeing is over time, we're gradually coming down. It's sort of up and down a little bit, depending on what's sort of in the news. But we do see a decline from last quarter, which is encouraging that firm leaders do feel like inflation is becoming less of an issue, relatively speaking. There's still pretty elevated concern, however. I do think we'll see in the fourth quarter that number notch down some more, particularly if the Federal Reserve cuts rates in September. All right, Thomas, I've done a lot of talking so far. So here's, we're going to have a few slides from you.
Yeah, so this is just kind of getting into, I guess, the next level down, looking at some of the data we've already looked at regarding consumer price indices and, what we can see, and kind of going back to my earlier comment about Fed being data dependent, needing to lower rates is, whether you're looking at the CPI or removing food and energy prices or the costs to households are still about 25% higher now than they were pre-pandemic. And, you know, those lines we want them to be going down, right? And they're not necessarily going down. They're not growing as rapidly as they were, say, in the second half of 2021 or 2022. But overall, the costs, you know, are just increasing at a slightly less higher rate than before.
So, Thomas, do we ever actually see these numbers go down, or do they just sort of even off for a time while wages catch up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in short periods, like a month over month, we might see some prices go down. We see that a little bit when the Fed first started raising rates. And actually, I think in a future slide, when we look at kind of the breakdown of goods versus services, we can see actual disinflation. Right. So, you know, when we look at how we spend our money, 70% of the things we're spending money on are really services, which is kind of labor, as opposed to goods, which are the physical objects. And so we could see that, you know, compared to, say, March 2022, for goods, items actually are slightly cheaper. So we have seen some disinflation there. Problem is services, which are wages, has continued to grow and keeps growing, right? So the total CPI is going to be the summation of these two lines. So one component, you know, definitely the costs are under control, but the services piece kind of continues to, you know, move up and to the right, which would, you know, I think is concerning. And so, you know, your question earlier of, you know, will the Federal Reserve reduce the rates by a full percentage point by the end of the year? We really want to see that orange line be flat, if not slightly declining, to be more confident that, you know, a 1% by the end of the year cut will happen.
And I think it's important to mention what I've talked about before, that these are the numbers, the PCE, that's what the Fed really looks at more closely than, say, those headline inflation numbers that I was talking about earlier. And I think it's to your point, right, that this is where the real sort of inflation, if you will, kind of hits consumers.
Right. Absolutely. So then if we, you know, kind of think about this inflation piece and the cost of goods and services and apply it to our own industry, what we have here on the left-hand side, basically the producer price index for non-residential construction components. On the right-hand side, producer price index for architectural engineering services. What we see is, you know, starting at least on the left-hand side. So this is primarily the commodities piece of non-residential construction, kind of peaked around spring 2022, actually declined a little bit, but just over the last quarter or so ticked up, but has been relatively flat. The issue is that massive growth that happened from basically the end of 2020 to the beginning of 2022, where the costs of construction basically went up close to 40%. Our member firms, you know, their cost of providing services, what we see is slowly grown about, I think, 15% over the same time frame, but actually just in the past 2 months, we've seen a decline in the cost of those services and the overall kind of construction delivery piece or infrastructure delivery piece. So, you know, this component, our industry as a part of the broader economy, seems to be leveling off, I would say.
So that's really good news, but I guess it's tempered by the fact that, you know, when prices go up, they tend to not fall, at least not as dramatically as when they went up. Yeah. So I haven't shown this slide in a while either, but I thought it was time to check in on 30-year fixed mortgage rates because so much of our economy is sort of driven in the initial stages by housing and people's ability to purchase houses, to move, and all the things that happen when you move, the things you buy, etc. And what we're seeing here is we're finally seeing some significant declines just in the last few months now, with the anticipation that the Federal Reserve will lower rates. The Treasury yields, which is the 10-year Treasury yield in particular, which is what 30-year mortgage rates tend to be pegged to, uh, um, those started to fall. And so what we're seeing is now that average rate is about 6.5%, whereas we had maxed out back in October of 23 last year at just about 8%. And that's a really big difference when you're talking about trying to buy a home, 1.5 percentage points. And we also know that about the rough majority of Americans who own a home, they're in the 5% range right now. So to get a lot of refinancing as well as new purchases, we're going to have to get well below 6%. But it does indicate some encouraging signs, particularly if the Federal Reserve into next year does keep reducing rates. So that's what you're going to want to look for. Again, Thomas and I, it seems like we're a bit more cautious in terms of how quickly we think the Fed will reduce the rates, but we do think that there'll be some easing in the coming months. All right, so just a reminder, please feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A as we go through our discussion today. We're happy to answer those questions for you. Now let's turn to how is the industry doing today. Thomas?
Yeah, so industry continues to be strong with year-over-year growth. We're basically at an all-time high in terms of, say, 2024 Q1, where the total AE services revenue was $115 billion, up 3.1% quarter over quarter, and up 7.4% year over year. Very strong growth. Looking back this same time last year, we were up 10.5% year over year. So growth is still strong, but that rate of growth is slowing down, essentially. But this was, a very strong performance this past quarter as well.
Yeah, so that's definitely good news. And what else do you have for us here?
So, looking at, say, this rate of growth, we see that there had been a lot of, especially over the past 8 years, a little bit of, I don't want to say whipsaw, but, up and down in terms of our growth rates, and just, kind of to think about the industry in a historical context, this whole period of during and immediately post COVID, as well as other forces happening, we had double-digit growth year over year. That seems unlikely in the immediate future, but this past reading, having still 7.4% growth, is really strong. On the right-hand side is looking at the employment in our industry, and what's interesting is that at the start of this year, seemed like we were hitting a bit of plateau in terms of total employment, but basically since May, we've continued to add more jobs to the industry. So that kind of would make sense. We are professional services. For revenue to be growing, you need more people working and billing. There's kind of a finite amount of billable hours per employee. So that is, an optimistic and, positive note that there are folks we can hire and bring into the industry, even though, I know you will touch on, we're still having capacity issues, even though we had some strong growth in terms of labor this past spring.
So Thomas, I remember last quarter when we were talking about this, and of course that line was starting to flatten out in terms of the employment numbers. You were saying that perhaps we were tapping out on the availability of the labor in the market,
Yeah.
but it looks like we've kind of taken another leg up.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure where the workers are coming from, seeing as it's so difficult to hire these days. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it could be because this is firm wide, as firms are maybe, say, diversifying their labor pool. They can be hiring, you know, AI experts, social media managers, people who are handling, say, public relations for clients in terms of infrastructure project delivery, items like that. It's as our member firms grow, the type of work they are doing is growing and diversifying. So, I can see that, say, the non-engineering piece can be growing, as well as just engineers. It's also possibly folks who had been on the sidelines are now applying for jobs. But yeah, I don't have one definitive answer, unfortunately.
Sure. No, well, I think all of those are really good points to make, and I'll have a few more comments on that later with some of the sentiment data that we collected. So speaking of the sentiment, this is our current economic sentiment, which those of you who have been watching our webinars for a while now will know. And what we see in terms of the condition of the U.S. economy, that actually went down by 1 point, which is really not a significant move. So it's holding steady. These are really at the highest levels they've been since we started conducting this survey 3 years ago. So that's really good news. And of course, the sentiment regarding the industry and the firm finances, they're plus 80 where they've been for the majority of the last 3 years. As you've noted, Thomas, we've had phenomenal growth coming out of the pandemic, and we continue to see sentiment within the industry and firms very, very strong, very, very positive. I don't know how long these numbers will stay elevated like this. I expect that at some point they may moderate, but for now, we continue to see very, very strong sentiment within our industry and regarding firm finances.
Hey,
And
Joe,
when
would
we
you
look at,
mind? I'm sorry, would you mind just explaining that net rating in case there's anyone new to this report?
sure. So, as I was saying before, we have the percentage of individuals who rate the economy, for instance, positively, and we'll have a certain percentage who rate it negatively. So we subtract the negatives from the positive, and that leaves us with that net rating. So this is basically the balance of individuals, whether it's positive or negative. And so when you see the balance of sentiment being positive, that's overall very good news. If you see the balance of sentiment being negative, that's cause for concern.
Thanks, Joe.
Sure. So when we look here at the detail, and this is similar to what you'll find in the full report, and we have a lot of detail in a lot of these questions in the report itself. And this is just one example of what you'll see in the report. This is the condition of firm finances. We show the current quarter, 2024 Q3, and the levels within the different regions, as well as firm size. And then we show the change versus the prior quarter and the change versus the prior year. And what you see here, a few interesting things to note. We do see a lot of declines from the last quarter when it comes to firm finances. Now, remember, these numbers are extremely high. So seeing some declines is not really a cause for concern right now. But looking at year over year, that's a little bit more interesting to me. So what jumps out at me there is firms in the West are feeling a little bit less optimistic than they were, say, a year ago. But again, it's still very positive. And also small firms, those with 1 to 25 FTEs, they're down about 10 points from they were a year ago. Now, sometimes these numbers can be a little bit volatile, and you'll see if you look at the 1 to 25 FTE firm size, they in the fourth quarter of last year were at a plus 66. So it tends to be a little bit volatile at times, but it's something to watch. It's a trend to watch. And of course, when you look at those firms that are 200 to 500 FTE and more than 500, those firms were, as I mentioned, almost at that plus 100 in the last quarter, which is almost impossible, but or it's hard to believe. So again, seeing some moderation there is not a cause for concern at all from my perspective. We also look at sentiment by sector, and here I had to, I updated this chart, so I apologize. The circles that I had, I did not bring over from the updated chart. But what you'll notice here is if you look down this column in Q3, there are certain items, certain sectors, I should say, that have the most positive readings. Roads and bridges is a plus 83. Water and wastewater is a plus 82. Energy and utilities plus 75. Transportation and airports is plus 79. So again, very, very strong positive numbers here in most sectors, and they're very, very high. There's a few areas that are a little bit lower, such as commercial real estate, but they're still on the positive side. So these are all very, very good numbers overall. And you can see quarter over quarter, there have been some declines. Again, I look at the year over year. That's sort of more important to me. And we have seen a few slight increases, a few slight declines, but nothing really dramatic here. So by and large, I think sector performance has been pretty strong and pretty steady over the last year. Thomas?
Yeah, and so, when we look at the current performance in construction and construction spending, at a top level, the overall construction market is starting to actually, not only plateau, but we had 2 months of slight growth decline. Certain sectors performing very well. The bottom sectors, we're seeing more sectors that are actually showing negative year-over-year growth. So just looking at, what's performing well, especially say with respect to manufacturing and power, they're seeing double-digit growth. However, this time last year, so August of 2023, manufacturing was growing at about like 75% year-over-year growth, which is just phenomenal. Now it's 25% year-over-year growth. That's still a very large year-over-year growth percentage, but we are seeing this, declining growth rates. And then in terms of bottom sectors, commercial is now down 10% year-over-year. Lodging, conservation, development down. They're not very large in terms of absolute values. I will say this time last year, the residential sector was down 10% year-over-year, really being impacted by interest rates and mortgage rates, like that chart you showed. I mean, I think it was close to 8% this time last year. But now residential is, slightly positive. And so it's kind of at the aggregate level, things are flat. And then these individual components, we're seeing kind of trade-offs, or some are declining, some are continuing to grow. So it's, in line with a lot of the other data points we're seeing, where there's kind of a flattening or plateauing that's happening.
Yeah, so that you answered my question for you there, Thomas. I was going to ask overall, you were showing winners and losers, so to speak, but overall you're saying that it's pretty much flat at the top line. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it is, the issue with some of these data series we report on is that, they get revised. And so we do have to, it's declining, but, that doesn't mean next month when they revise it, it turns out it was actually flat or increasing. But yeah, the past 2 months construction put in place has declined.
Okay, good to know. When we look at backlog, this is reported to us through the sentiment survey. This is what firms are reporting as their actual backlog in terms of if they were not to win any more projects, how many months of work would they have? And we've seen this pretty steady over the last few years now, between 11 and 12 months. We've obviously seen it at 11 months here for the last year, and then in Q3 it jumped up to 12 months. But in Q2 of 2023, so that would be last year, it was also at 12 months. So this number tends to go between 11 and 12 fairly regularly, but it's always good news to see it go up a notch. So turning to hiring and looking back at the workforce issue, we see again that 9 out of 10 firms are still hiring. They have open positions, and the median number has been steady at 5. This has not changed much at all. And during the course of our sentiment survey, these numbers overall have not changed dramatically either. So this is, again, just pointing to the tightness of the labor market within our industry, and that is continuing to hold. We also look at a particular metric, which is open positions as a percentage of overall FTEs. This gives us a sense for how many unfilled positions there are within a firm. And we see here that it's been at 9%, very, very steady over the last year. So roughly, 1 out of 11 positions at a firm is vacant. And that's pretty significant. When you look at the detail by region, it's pretty stable. It varies a little bit by region here and there. By firm size, it's also stable, but you'll see a significant difference between the smallest firms with 16% versus the other size firms at 7 and 6%. That's really a factor of the smallness of the firm. So if you have 10 people in your firm and you've got 2 open positions, you're going to have a 20% rate there. So that's really what's going on with those numbers. But nonetheless, it's very real. There are a lot of open positions at firms these days. All right, so let's take a turn to the future and see what we can help you all look forward to. So this is a slide that's a little bit old now. It's from last October, and we will be updating it in October of this year. So I really wanted to show it so that you all would be aware that this is going to be updated at the ACEC Fall Conference in New Orleans in October. So stay tuned for that. What we saw last year at that time was that we were anticipating about 8% nominal growth in 2023. And if we sort of look at Thomas's numbers that he shared with us a little bit earlier, I think we're pretty much on track. Your year-over-year number, Thomas, was 7.4%. We're anticipating 7.9 for the full year of 2023 and 4.8 for 2024. So at least, in 2023, I think we're pretty solid. I think in 2024, I'm getting a sense we might see a little bit of an increase in those numbers, but we're going to have to wait and see. I don't have those numbers yet, so please stay tuned and see what we come up with and what the future has in store for us in October. But something else to point out is that we do have the nominal growth versus the real growth. Real growth takes into account inflation and the impact that inflation has on growth. And you can see those numbers are significantly lower. We have been anticipating that as inflation comes down, that we will also see less of an impact from the nominal growth. But again, over time, we're looking at perhaps real output growth of around 1 to 2%. So keep that in mind. We'll give you updated numbers in October. Now, when we look at sentiment ratings, it's very interesting to see the condition of the U.S. economy has jumped by 12 points. And this is the highest level we've ever seen. This is really, really good news. People are much, much more confident now than they have been in the last 3-4 years about the condition of the U.S. economy going forward. So that is really encouraging. And when you have more positive sentiment about the economic surroundings, you're more likely to take additional risks. You're more likely to perhaps have more expansion plans, take out loans, etc. Or as Thomas said, maybe you're moving into new areas, hiring different types of individuals that are non-engineer staff. So this is just a good number in terms of the confidence is growing within our industry about the health of the U.S. economy. So that is very, very good news. In terms of industry sentiment as well as firm finances, those numbers notched up 1 point over last quarter, which again is not really a significant change, but we're seeing very steady numbers here, very solid numbers. They're positive, and so that is also good news for the future. When we look at that detail again about the U.S. economy, now this is again the future sentiment of the U.S. economy, and you break it down by region and firm size, you see a lot of really good positive numbers here. And especially when you look at the change year over year and quarter over quarter, really strong increases in both, with one exception, which is that firm size of 26 to 50 FTE. Again, we tend to see some volatility within that particular area. You can see it was a negative 30 in Q4 of last year, then it jumped up to a plus 10. So there tends to be a little volatility sometimes, but overall, very good news regarding the firm leaders and the confidence they have in the economy going forward. When we look at the sector performance a year from now, again, we also see all of these are now positive. You can see that commercial real estate, which is the second line from the top, it had been negative for a very, very long time in terms of future sentiment. We finally see that future sentiment turning slightly positive. We'll take any good news we can in that market. The residential area had turned positive in the first quarter of this year and has been fairly steady over the last 9 months. But that, again, is very welcome news compared to a year ago at this time. So those two areas are definitely looking better. Data centers, that's an area of growth we've continued to see improving over the last several years. What's interesting to me on this slide, and I'd love your thoughts on this as well, Thomas, we see the strongest sectors, which are circled in blue, are those IIJA fueled sectors, but those are also the sectors that are seeing year over year declines. Some of them by a point or two, but water and wastewater is down by 10 since last year. So I'm curious, Thomas, what's your read on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is really going back, looking at that construction put in place data that last year, the highs were just so high that you kind of have nowhere else to go but down in terms of the total, say, spending or money that's being allocated. I also don't know how much, well, not to steal your thunder, but uncertainty over the future and, reauthorizations and what funding is coming from where is going to be playing a role in folks' decision making now as they think about what will happen. Last year we still had several years of IIJA rollout we know coming, but that's slowly coming to an end.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm taking from this as well, that we're starting to see the end of the IIJ funding, and while projects are going to continue to be in progress for some time, the new projects are going to be coming to an end soon. So I do think that's weighing on future sentiment in those areas. When we ask individuals why they feel negative, these are the reasons they're giving us. Now, there's two things to keep in mind here. One is that the number of individuals who are turning or who have a negative sentiment is declining. So that's the N. The N equals, that's the number of individuals that fall into this group. So that's been steadily declining. But it's interesting that the reasons for negative sentiment have sort of stayed relatively stable in terms of their rank order. So political uncertainty and the political environment, that topped out at number one. It took the number one spot at the beginning of this year. Not surprising at all. This is a presidential election year, and there are lots of reasons on both sides of the aisle to have concerns about the political environment. So that stays at number one, although it has dropped down just slightly from last quarter. It's important, I should note, that we were fielding this survey right in the middle of the fielding of this survey was when the assassination attempt on former President Trump occurred. So I'm happy to report that that did not affect our results to this study. And that's good news despite the sort of seriousness of that situation. General economic uncertainty is at the second spot, and inflation and rising costs is still a concern among those who hold a negative outlook on the economy or the industry. We also added for the first time R&D tax amortization. So that's why you only see one bar down there at the bottom. we wanted to see if that was weighing on sentiment, and it came in at 15%. So it's certainly not a huge concern in terms of sentiment. We know it's a real big issue and a real financial concern for many, many firms. But in terms of future sentiment, that's not what is driving sentiment. You'll also notice that increasing interest rates, that has fallen quite a bit, particularly from a year ago, and that's good news. The workforce shortages number is also declining a little bit. It's still elevated, of course, but it's coming down just a little bit. So perhaps firms are starting to feel a little bit less worried about finding workers, despite the fact that we know it's challenging to hire right now.
And so, looking at these components that can continue to impact inflation, but, our project delivery, looking at our global supply chain pressure index, we see, when we did this webinar at the end of May, we were in negative territory for global supply chain pressure. It's kind of come back up. I think we're okay, basically. And this is just, though, again, this is going to be affecting, say, the cost of goods. So we look at what happened in 2020, 2021 here on our chart, that corresponds pretty well to that sharp rise in, say, the costs of non-residential commodity construction delivery, things like your concrete, your steel, all those items. So there's nothing on this front to suggest prices along, that component are going to kind of go out of control anytime soon. So it's good news.
And I think, Thomas, what's interesting is when we look at the history of the prior question that I just talked about, these supply chain issues were much, much more of a concern in our sentiment study a couple years ago, and they've come down dramatically over the last year or two. I think that's really closely matching the data that you're seeing here. So, oh, sorry there, that's my fault. There we go. Okay, so when we look at sentiment regarding future backlog, it did slip just a little bit. We kind of hit a high watermark in the first quarter of this year at plus 40, and now we're at plus 35. It's still only 1 point below where we were a year ago, but again, still positive. That's good news, even if it's down just a few notches from the high of Q1. So there's no real concern at the moment. Now, if we see this number continue to go down over the coming quarters and it starts to weaken even further, then maybe that's something that we'll start to be a little bit more concerned about. But at the moment, I'm not concerned. And when we look at the detail of the backlog numbers, this kind of shows you where that's coming from, mostly from the Northeast, as well as firms that have more than 500 FTE. That's where the largest declines are quarter over quarter and year over year. So that's where the majority of this change is coming from. And so again, it's something to watch, but perhaps we're seeing larger firms, particularly those in the Northeast, maybe they're seeing a little bit of some changes right now, but this is certainly not something that is industry-wide affecting all firms of all sizes. And looking at future hiring sentiment, so again, this is notched down 6 points from last quarter. So again, that's good, but it's still very, very high. And in fact, when you think about the level at which this stands, sentiment regarding future hiring, it's much higher than, say, concerns about inflation. And I'll have a few more slides to show you in a moment. So we do see some slight moderation of future hiring sentiment, still very, very high, however. So this is where I wanted to dig in just a little bit on this particular metric. We've asked this a few times over the last several years, and this is the single largest barrier to growing my company is the lack of qualified workers. And here again, a positive number is not good because of the way the question is worded. And we've seen this number increase over the last year. So the lack of qualified workers is more of a concern now than inflation is among firms. That is a change from a year ago. So while inflation is still something of concern, it has now sort of become less, and we think that it's going to ease even further. And now the real issue is squarely on the lack of qualified workers. We asked a new question this year, and for the first time this last quarter, we asked in general, how easy or difficult is it for your organization to do the following? And you can see 89% of firms say it's difficult to find qualified engineers right now. That, I think, really showcases how challenging the labor market is within our industry. And we anticipate that there's really not an end in sight for that in the short term. Retaining qualified engineers, a little less difficult, but it's still more difficult than not. Finding non-engineering staff is, again, a little less difficult than finding qualified engineers, but it is still very difficult. So we see a lot of challenges here in the future, particularly with workforce issues. The likelihood of recession, this is again the average consensus among all firm leaders. And I should have mentioned earlier on that we had about 650 individuals respond to this survey, which is a large number of individuals. So this really is a really good read across the market. We see that likelihood of recession stands at 40% in terms of sentiment, and it's down from a year ago, and also down from fourth quarter of last year. I think we're going to see this number fall as we go through the future, but in the last quarter, it kind of held steady there. All right, so just to wrap it up, and of course, we'll answer any questions you all have. We have some time left as well. But just to sort of round out what we were talking about, consumer spending is remaining very strong. It is 2/3 of the economy, and we don't see that slowing down. Unemployment is rising, which, as we talked about, is a good thing for now. We wouldn't want it to go too far, but consumers are continuing to spend. And we still do see consumers have buying power, although it has been eroded a bit due to the inflation we've had over the last few years. As Thomas mentioned, overall prices are up significantly, and even if they steady or even out, they're still a lot higher than they were a few years ago. And as you mentioned, Thomas, services is still going up. Wages are rising. It's a good thing for consumers. It's a good thing for the workers, but it's obviously causing a challenge for the employers on that side of the equation. We do see that the lack of workers is inhibiting firm growth and profitability. So we expect that to continue. Inflation concerns are easing, and we do think now that, based on what the Fed has said, they are ready to start cutting rates. We'll see exactly how quickly they cut the rates and when they cut them, but as the Fed stated on Friday, they are ready to start looking at cuts. The housing market's doing better. It's stabilizing. It's coming more into equilibrium now. We have more houses that are available on the market. There's still, now, some of you will note that sales are at their lowest point as they've been in many, many years. But the good news, again, is that the sort of equilibrium of buyers and sellers is coming back into a more favorable condition. So as we see interest rates go down, and we continue to see interest rates go down, we do think that that's going to help the residential market as well. And then recession concerns. No one's even talking about recession anymore. Honestly, in the public sphere, if you listen to the news, we don't hear any talk about recession. So that longest anticipated recession in U.S. history appears to not be coming, at least not in the near term, and folks are no longer talking about that. So that's good news as well. Now, it's always interesting, Thomas. Whenever we get complacent, whenever we feel like everything's fine, sometimes we get a shock to the system. And that, in my opinion, would sort of be the biggest concern I have, is something just coming out of left field that we weren't anticipating that could cause a shock to the system and that nobody would have anticipated. But what's your biggest thought or concern in terms of the industry and the economy over the next year? You think everything's good and solid, or do you have any concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think my main concern, honestly, is going to be the lowering of interest rates and inflation not really being under control. And, they lower interest rates a little bit, and then we see prices spike back up. And so then the Fed is in a tough position where they don't go all the way down. They're going to have to pivot and start to raise interest rates again. I don't think all the data is pointing that we have prices really under control to start doing some of the interest rate cut expectations that other people are planning on, but that's just all conjecture at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. My concern is also that they start cutting too soon and we see inflation go back up, and I think that would certainly cause some hand wringing. So we will certainly wait and see what happens. Daphne, any other questions that have come in for us?
Actually, one just popped in. Do you have a handle on how much IIJA funding has been spent versus left over?
Thomas, I think that might be more.
Yeah, no, I know that I had looked at this towards the beginning of the year, and it's something, well, it's hard to get a total number, but I feel like there's 65 to 70% has been like, let's call it allocated. And then of that amount that's allocated, I'm not sure like how much actually has been given to the project and the project has broken ground versus, you've been told you will get $100 million to do this project, but the actual getting the money from point A to point B hasn't fully happened yet. But I think it's something about, 65% is, let's say, you're marked for projects. So basically we have another 18 months of these different programs, like the big, DOT grant programs for mega projects and airports and rail and NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. They're probably about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way allocated.
Thanks, Thomas. We have one other, I guess, kind of comment. This is a very US-centric look. However, could the shock to the system emanate from the Middle East or Eastern Europe? So something from outside of the country coming in and having influence, or that shock that you're talking about, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously in the financial crisis, that was born and bred here in the US, but we've also seen crises occur outside the US and affect us here. I think particularly the Middle East is a very, very high concern to me. If we have a broader war break out among many countries in the Middle East, that will certainly cause an issue. We obviously now are in a much better position with regard to oil production in the US than we've ever been, especially relative to other countries. And so we're a little bit better insulated, but that does not mean that we could weather that without any problem. So I think the Middle East is a concern. I think what happens in Ukraine and Russia, that's always a concern. I think a really far-fetched at the moment concern would be China invading Taiwan, but that's, certainly a possibility. So yes, absolutely. I think there are many potential shocks that could come from outside the US that would absolutely affect us. So it's hard to know, what could happen, but yes, that's absolutely a valid concern.
And to that point, one Joe mentioned earlier and showed the forecast chart from our annual economic assessment and 5-year forecast report, which will be coming out in October. The great thing about that product is it allows us to take some of those possible shocks and put them against our methodology and see what would happen. And for those of you who have been following this for a while, you might remember when before IIJA was what it is, and the Democrats and Republicans were each kind of shopping their own idea of what that bill might look like. We were able to take our economic model and put both of those scenarios against it and identify what would happen to our industry from a revenue perspective, from a jobs perspective, et cetera, depending on what those scenarios look like. So that's the wonderful thing of having these types of economic models to use, is that we can apply all different types of shocks, whether they're financial, whether they are geopolitical, et cetera, and see how that's going to impact us moving forward. So we're fortunate to have that at our fingertips as well. So I don't see any more questions, and I know that we're up against the half hour, so I am going to wrap us up and thank you all for joining us. The Q4 sentiment will be coming out shortly, so please, when you see that come across your email, complete it. We are very interested in getting your perspectives. This is not just for the CEO in the firm or one person in the firm. It's for all the senior leadership in the firm. And so many of you will get it within the same firm. And we really are looking for all the perspectives that you have to share with us. We look forward to seeing you in October at the fall conference, sharing the new economic assessment and the Q4 sentiment with you then. Joe will be back with us for that. Thomas, thank you as always for joining, and Joe, for your not just all the great data you shared, but also your perspectives and insights. And here is a link to the report that we just shared with you. A lot more data is in there than we were able to share in this hour. So please grab that QR code. You can also get it off of our website, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.